Jennifer Baumgardner is a former editor at Ms. She writes for The Nation, Glamour, and National Public Radio. Amy Richards is a member of the advisory board at Ms., a co-founder of the Third Wave Foundation, an activist group for young feminists, and the author of Shopping in New York. Which is an excellent read. Together, they are the founders of Soapbox Inc., a speakers bureau representing outspoken experts with a progressive take on current events and culture. But you probably know them as the co-authors of a little book called Manifesta. Well, they have done it again. Only this time, instead of busting through myths and laying out a vision of what feminism is and can be, they're busting through myths and laying out a very detailed, easy-to-access structure for becoming a better, more proactive, more effective, and world-changing feminist. Now, I'll be honest, while I thought this book sounded like a great idea in general, I was pretty sure that I didn't need an advice book myself to become a better feminist. But I'm here to tell you that not only did Grassroots prove me wrong, it made me really happy to have been proven wrong. And here to talk about it, please welcome Amy and Jennifer.
Well, as Jacqueline was saying, she was wrong. We should put Jacqueline's endorsement on the book, and then the other person's endorsement is my boyfriend's mother, who doesn't have an activist bone in her body, and so this quote means nothing unless you know her, but she read it, and she's like, everyone should read that book. It's so helpful. And so I wish that we could bottle both of your quotes and put them on here. But thank you all for coming, and it's great to know that Center of New Words was able to be reborn as this center. It used to be a bookstore, for those of you who didn't know, and rather than going the course of many independent bookstores of collapsing and not being able to survive against the big ones, it chose to reinvent itself or to keep this part of its existence. And so it's great for us as we travel around to be able to return to places that we've been to in the past. And so it's great to be here. And we're just going to talk to you a little bit tonight about kind of our journey over the past 4 years since we published Manifesta, and read a little bit to you from Grassroots, a field guide for feminist activism. And as Jacqueline kind of said in her introduction, Manifesta was written because Jennifer and I were being asked constantly, what is feminism? We were being asked this question by feminists, and we were being asked this question by innocent 11-year-olds who wanted to start a wrestling team for girls in their middle school and were told that they can't. We were being asked it by, 15-year-olds who were called Bella Abzug, and they're like, what does that mean? We were being asked it by, 50-year-olds whose daughter were, being fired because they were pregnant. And it was always asked in this very innocent way, what is feminism and what does it mean? And so Manifesta was meant to be a documentation from our perspective of where feminism was roughly kind of in the year 2000 or kind of the years leading up to it. And I think that we did a pretty good job of answering that question, what is feminism, because we don't get it as much anymore. And kind of the current question is, what does it mean to be a feminist? It's kind of an evolved question. And a related question is, what can I do? And when I first started getting this question, I was, and Jennifer too, we were both lecturing on different college campuses, and then I have this online advice column, Ask Amy, where I was asked a lot, what can I do? And at first, we took the easy way out. We'd be like, call Planned Parenthood, call Greenpeace, call Coalition for the Homeless. Those organizations have volunteer structures. They'll be able to answer your question. And I thought that our job was done. Well, lo and behold, people would come back to us because they'd say, I called, but they told me to call my politician, they told me to send money to organizations that I care about, and they told me to volunteer, but when I went to the volunteer meeting, all we did was schedule another volunteer meeting a month later. And it's not that these three things aren't important and necessary, but it wasn't enough. And so people would come back to us and they'd say, I did what you said, but I still want to do something. I don't feel like I've done anything. And so Jennifer and I kind of looked at each other and thought, oh my gosh, now what are we going to do? We have to actually take responsibility for this. And so Grassroots was kind of born out of desperation in some ways of us being asked this question so many times that we were tired of answering it. And because we really wanted to propose new ideas and propose, I think, a plan of what it means to be politically involved today. And the book Grassroots, I think, had kind of two questions that we were struggling with when we went into it. One was, what can I do? And so the book is filled with examples of people who have done something above and beyond the generic three, as we've kind of dubbed them. And I would say the most important message is that it's not that you do more in your life, but that it's you kind of re-examine your life with an activist lens, and how can you take the things you're already doing and look at them as activism. And so it's not that you join an organization that you go to once a month, but it's how do you take your job at Starbucks or take your job at Harvard University and make it activism, create the activism from the inside out. The second question, come on in and sit down. The second question that the book was grappling with, come on in. Welcome, everybody. Come on in. The second question that we were struggling with was, what does it actually mean to be somebody who is politically engaged? What does it actually mean to be somebody who is pro-choice or pro-environment? And that's a very difficult question, because I think that there are some tangible answers. It does mean that you say that's not funny to a homophobic joke. That means that you go march on Washington if you feel motivated. It means that you do send letters to your congresspeople. It means that you kind of speak up on a daily basis. It means that you support both businesses and not-for-profit organizations that seem to be carrying on a mission that you care about. But we kind of realize that it's a larger question, because once you've done all of those things, you're still left with this question, or you're still left with these issues. We still have reproductive injustice. We still have economic injustice, even if all of us are doing that bare minimum. And so while the book, I think, does a really good job of laying out things that everybody can do on a daily basis, there remains this kind of larger question that I hope inspires you all to have conversations in your community of what does it mean to be somebody who is politically involved and committed to social justice. And that answer is really going to vary for each individual. But our hope is that if each person is at least asking themselves that question and coming up with answers, then collectively it's going to lead to greater social change.
So one of our major goals was to make this book really about effective activism. So we sort of, I'm grateful for what you said, that you felt like you still got something from it, because of course we were worried that it made us look like we were, dumbasses who didn't realize that there were really big problems in the world. And we were like, you know what, sometimes just buying someone flowers is, that we were pointing too much to the small things that we were calling grace activism, to the kind of more one-off acts. But the reason we wanted to do that was because we had learned we identify as activists, and we had learned through our own evolution in becoming people who would call ourselves that it was in these small details, and it was in the kind of the least identifiable as activist actions that we were the most effective. And some examples are rather than applying for a grant from the Ford Foundation. I mean, we've both jumped through plenty of hoops and applied for grants. And we both applied for fellowships, and recently Amy was like, I've just decided I'm someone who doesn't get fellowships. And I'm like, you know what, I think I need to decide that too, because there are other ways to get things done. And one of the messages of Grassroots is to be able to kind of honestly assess, what are your resources? What is your circle? What is your environment that you can access? And for people who get fellowships and for people who are downstairs, I'm like, for people who can get fellowships, or for people who do get fellowships, or for people who do get major grants, it's partially, of course, the legitimacy and wonderfulness of their grant proposal or what they're working on, and it's partly that they've accessed their community, and their community happens to be foundations, or their community happens to be major universities that offer fellowships or things like that. And if you're somebody who's not in that space, that might not be the first place you should go. So where could you go? Where could you go if you were just me and Amy and you're not going to get any fellowships, as we've decided? And we realized that to fund our work, besides just sort of doing it gratis, other ways you can actually get funding is to look to your own community. And I've heard Amy tell this story from her own life many, many times, and another point we make in here is how often as activists you don't practice what you preach, and then something will call you up short and you'll realize, oh, I should just do that thing that I tell everyone else to do and maybe it'll work. But you always worry that it won't, so you're afraid to do it and you apply for the grant from the Ford Foundation. But anyway, I was fundraising recently for a series of events, but one of them was a documentary around this issue of women and men, but women specifically, telling the truth about their abortions, just coming out and saying, I had an abortion, and then telling their abortion story. And so there were T-shirts that were part of it, and then there's this film. And I needed to raise at least $3,000 to get the film off the ground. And I was kind of like, where am I going to get that? And I think I'll have to write a grant proposal. And And Amy's told the story for a long time, and it's in Manifesta, about how she raised the initial seed money for one of the first activist projects she ever did, which was a cross-country voter registration drive. And what she did was she thought of the people in her life who had summer homes, Volvo station wagons, or, a car at school, or an in-ground swimming pool. And she was like, I think they have discretionary income. I'm going to write them a letter. I'm going to write them a letter and tell them what I'm working on, tell them how important I think it is to have an actual participatory democracy, and give them exact sum of what I'm trying to raise and what it would go for, which is basically food and sleeping bags and the buses to get people across country. And then I'll, write the shameless, follow-up letter or call them and see what happens. And lo and behold, she got the money. She was very surprised to get these checks, but they came in, and she also started a conversation with people that she maybe hadn't known this side of her, or they hadn't known that she cared about democracy in this way, or they hadn't had a conversation about democracy in this way. So she opened up that as well. And so I was worrying about where I was going to get the money, and my mom was visiting from Fargo, North Dakota, which is where she resides and where I was raised. And she said, she was talking about her friends and how they were pro-choice and how they kind of follow what I'm doing. And when I go home to Fargo, I often see these people at parties and luncheons, and my mom has a lot of luncheons. And she or I or one of us thought of the fact of oh, well, that's maybe I could do what I've heard Amy say that she did, and I've told the story a million times, heard her tell it a million times, and actually write them a letter. And I was very scared because I didn't actually know if they were really pro-choice, or if they were pro-choice, if they would want to fund this idea of people saying I had an abortion. It was very scary for me to do it in my own home, as opposed to talking to you guys about I had an abortion T-shirts and movie, because I'm just I'm assuming we're all on the same page, or if we're not, I probably won't know, you won't tell me, or you won't gossip about me to my, in Fargo, where it could get back to my parents or whatever. And it felt very risky, but lo and behold, I got almost 100% responses, and I would say 90% were with checks, and people writing me notes, some offering critiques of some of the stuff that they felt I was saying, but being reasonably grateful that I had reached out to them, and some people really saying, go on, that was really great. And it made me feel much more vested in the project, and much more sure that it actually had some sort of constituency. And sometimes when you're working from New York or Boston, you think, oh, sure, I think this, but that's because we live in wonderful New York or Boston. But, back in the red states, everyone will hate us. And it made me realize that in the red states, there were people that supported the things that I was talking about, and that the red state sort of blue state dichotomy is stupid. So demystifying what activism is, showing the ways in which you are vulnerable occasionally as an activist. You are vulnerable every time you're trying to create change or access power. But then also sort of how easy or simple it can be if you're willing to do it is inherent, I think, in a lot of the stories. And Amy and I focus on some of our successes and failures, a lot of our failures, because we want to show that sometimes having a great idea or a project, you run with it for a while and nothing comes of it, but you still learn something from it. And we detail a recycling project that basically went nowhere. But we spent lots of time in here and talk about how there was still some value to just risking trying. So I'm going to read from the prologue. It's called Portrait of an Activist. Noam Chomsky looks like an activist. He wears practical, worn clothing and eyeglasses. He's old, and he clearly cares not about Prada's or Gucci's designs, just about how and under what conditions the clothing is made. We say he's old because, it's the people who were active in the 60s and 70s who really know how change is made, and those of us who are younger are lame. A venerated professor of linguistics at MIT, he lectures around the world, and he has written 70 political books thus far, and at the rate he is going will write 70 more before he is through. Chomsky's beat is demystifying world politics, global economies, and the media. His specific message is that average citizens like you have the power to hold those huge forces accountable. When activists want to know how to protest the war in Iraq or how to dismantle the World Trade Organization, they turn to Chomsky for analysis. He always knows where injustice lies, cutting through complex worlds with his laser IQ. You've told us what was wrong, but what can we do about it? Is a frequent question in the Q&A after his talks. You've got to organize, is Chomsky's perennial response. Well, what does it mean to organize? What does organizing look like? Well, according to a profile of Chomsky in The New Yorker, even his wife describes his "you've got to organize" response as his, quote, fake answer, given to comfort people from his depressing predictions about the state of the world. Now, we don't see his answer as false, but simply as too broad. As feminist activists, we are confronted with this question too, and we've concluded that an accurate and responsible answer is different for each individual. The details of organizing vary depending on who you are and what you seek to change. For ourselves, that awareness came slowly, but eventually we grew to understand that being an activist didn't mean adding an identity or task to our lives, but simply recognizing the opportunities for change that our lives as responsible, passionate citizens already included. So we asked ourselves, do we have a few dollars to give, or a few friends who might help protest the execution of a young man on death row? Our mode and expression as activists are based on what jobs we have, where our talents lie, what we care about, where we live, and other individual details. Not everyone has the power of Chomsky to draw crowds or the IQ or time to read hundreds of pages of wire service reports each day, but everyone has the power to impact the world. Indeed, that is actually Chomsky's message. The problem, to which even Chomsky contributes, is getting to the next step, action. That, we realize, requires demystifying activism for those eager to be involved, but confused and possibly intimidated by what that might entail. And then we talk about how we kind of shied away from using the word activism, not because it's a bad word. It's a wonderful word, and thought, should we say service or volunteerism or include words like that? Because activism sort of sounds so dramatic, and it makes people think that maybe it's only for people who are willing to chain themselves to the White House or live in a tree for a year or alienate their whole family at Thanksgiving by talking about factory farming of the turkeys. So we recognized that stress. But then we thought, on the other hand, we really do believe that social change is possible and simple at its core, and this book could be a call for everyone to find this activist within. So that in the same way that we think that all of us as feminists have a responsibility to figure out what feminism means for us and to figure out what our women's movement's going to be or our feminist movement is going to be, we also have the right and responsibility and opportunity, invitation to do that as activists. It's there for all of us. And then we go on to contrast Noam Chomsky with Elle Woods from Legally Blonde 2, because we pretty much think that people don't think that she looks like an activist, because she's in a sorority and she wears pink, she has a standing hair appointment, she carries her dog Bruiser in a leather bag, and she wears Gucci and maybe doesn't care under what conditions the clothing is made. But in that movie, she does manage to find what her value system is and find a cause that I think is a really important cause, which is animal cruelty, preventing animal cruelty, not supporting it, and testing on animals. And she, rather than kind of just going along with the gridlock that is Capitol Hill and getting things done in D.C., she finds ways to access her unique resources, like her huge phone tree of sorority sisters and the fact that the female senators also have standing hair appointments and she can talk to them there. She realizes enough who she is and has confidence in it that she can use those places to break through the gridlock in Capitol Hill. And Amy and I saw that movie on a plane traveling back from lecturing somewhere, and we were really tired, but we were both crying watching it, because it did seem so much to say what we say, which it isn't what you look like that makes you an activist. It isn't something you don. It really is, your effectiveness and your ability to project your value system into making the world more reflect your value system.
And we cried in part because we were in the midst of finishing this book, and it felt like it really summed up our message a lot. I don't want people who've not seen the movie to think it's like a tearjerker in any way. I mean, it felt so right for what we were trying to say, and it felt like the right expression. And the great thing about Elle Woods is what she does in the movie is actually very simple. And one of the things that Jennifer and I were concerned about with Grassroots is that people who were hardcore activists or people who were really politically motivated might say, oh, it's too simplistic for me. It's like what Jacqueline said at the beginning, oh, I'm above that. And yet we actually think, and Jennifer said this in the part that she read, it is that we need to be very simple. When, we both get to the end of a great book like No Logo, for instance, by Naomi Klein about globalization, its negative impacts, you're like, oh, great, now I'm pissed, but what do I do? And we want to be able to lay out step by step what people should do. Not that you have to follow it step by step, but we really wanted to break it down. And we were struggling with, we felt like what often gets reported on is the conclusion, or is the ends, but not the means. And you hear about, for instance, a great woman like Nancy Lublin who founded Dress for Success to outfit women who were transitioning from welfare to work. But you don't learn that it began with Nancy coming home one day and being really annoyed that she was in law school and being told that as she goes out to these job interviews, she really has to dress the part and dress the way the female partners dress in these law firms if she wants to get hired, and kind of countering that to reading these articles about women transitioning from welfare to work. And she was like, well, do they get that information? Who's telling them that they should do that? And realizing that she wanted to do that. And then she went on to create Dress for Success in a church basement in New York City, started with a few gently worn suits, and then it grew into national sponsorship like Ann Taylor and Eileen Fisher, and it is now in, I think every state has a Dress for Success. And we forget that those projects begin with often one person or two people or three people sitting around a dining room table or dinner table saying, are you annoyed by this too, or do you think there's anything I can do? And so we hope that those of you who read Grassroots think it is a simple book, because that was our intention, was to break it down. And one of the other experiences was that when we were in the midst of writing this, I was doing a project with the Columbia School of Public Health on welfare reform. And I felt like I was having all these conversations with people who were like, oh, I know welfare reform is terrible. We really have to have better welfare reform. I was like, oh, I know, and I'm working on this project. And I was really I was taking this research that was done that essentially documented how mothers of chronically ill children are doubly penalized when it comes to welfare reform, because they get pushed into these jobs, then they're bad mothers for leaving their chronically ill children, but then when they leave their jobs to care for their children, they get fired because they're the last hired, and it's this kind of never-ending cycle. And I said to the people who had done this, I was like, what do we need to do? And there were some concrete things that we needed to do. We needed to change the definition of work, as some states had done, like the state of Maine, to say that work is taking care of a child or work is taking care of an elderly parent. We also need to take the definition of work and expand it to higher education. If you're working towards a degree, that is work. There were also states that had creatively said that the number of years could be, manipulated based on, you could take 6 months then and 6 months later. And so we were looking at all these positive things. But at the end of the day, I was sort of like, well, I still don't think we've solved the problem of welfare reform in this country. In the midst of it, read an article about, actually, it took place here at Boston's Children's Hospital, and there was a boy who kept coming in with repeated asthma attacks, and the doctor and the nurse kept saying, this is what you have to do, and after appointment, he would come back. And the nurse finally said, something isn't right, and so made a site visit to the boy's house in public housing and said, oh my gosh, you have to rip up this carpet that is riddled with mites, and you have to take down this leaking pipe. And that's what's not able to rid him of the asthma. And the mother made 5 appeals to the housing authority to make these changes, and they never responded. And then the nurse kind of took it upon herself to involve the lawyers at Children's Hospital to write a letter to the housing authority and get them to do it. And that was eventually done. And I believe that it was probably a simple gesture on the part of the nurse to get the lawyers to write this letter. Now, and then the end of the story is that the boy was cured and he was able to go back to school, and the mother was no longer a bad mother. Now, on the surface, it would sound entirely simplistic if I said to you, you care about welfare reform? Go rip up, mite-ridden carpets and go fix leaky pipes, because it sounds so superficial and cosmetic. But in fact, it's often these very simple things that are both the cause of much larger problems, but it's also the very simple things that lead to much greater change. And so the message of Grassroots is very much that there are things that we probably are already doing in our daily lives that we could just do a little bit more of. And it might feel defeating to be one person doing one thing, but once we start sharing those stories with other people, we realize that there is collective activism going on, and that I might be doing something in my world and in my community, but that is corresponding to something that somebody else is doing in their world and in their community. And so the end of Grassroots is a chapter called The Revolutionary Next Door. And this kind of sums up that message of the book, that it is what we do in our everyday lives. The rest of the chapters in the book are kind of designed around different types of people, like high school students and college students and people in their 20s and artists and people in the workforce. And it's not meant for people to just read the chapter that kind of speaks to you, because in each chapter we take on a number of different issues, and in each chapter kind of reveal different ways to approach different issues. And it's our hope that you can, pick and kind of choose. You can take one issue and apply it to another person's kind of means. And the last chapter is meant to kind of be like, what can we just do in our everyday way? So the final frontier as an activist is having it be in you, so integrated into your life that it's instinctual, not premeditated. Your life no longer contains the question, what can I do? Because the way you lead your life is the answer. Once you try on the identity of an activist, it starts to feel natural. This is the sort of thing we're talking about. When you go to the dentist, you leave your copy of Ms., Color Lines, or Bust in the waiting room, on top of or next to People and Town and Country, introducing your fellow patients to a perspective that is missing from mainstream media. And if you're like me and you actually read Ms. and Color Lines, it's like you can go to the dentist, leave your copies, and actually read People in Town and Country while you're at the dentist. But just make sure to put Ms. on top of it when you're leaving. If you're shopping, you go into the Gap armed with cards identifying where and under what conditions their jeans were made. After all, you don't have to be an expert on child labor practices to inform other shoppers about sweatshop labor. At the post office, you buy the more costly breast cancer stamps that donate a percentage to research, or the Thurgood Marshall stamps to show that there is support for Black heritage. Both stamps send a message of your values to your correspondents. Besides bringing your own bags to the grocery store, you bring back your returnables to put them directly into the hands of a bottle redeemer. If you are at a job interview, you ask about the policy on same-sex partner benefits and prescription birth control coverage, regardless of whether either issue affects you personally. In fact, it's sometimes better if it doesn't affect you personally, so it can't be written off as a selfish interest. Instead of the latest Hollywood movie, you go to the women's basketball game in your town to prove that they have an audience and that the professional players deserve to have a semi-comparable salary to the men's players. After your workout, you lobby the gym for towels that cover people who are larger than a size 2. And while reading the morning paper, you write a positive letter to the editor commending the paper for having a female sports columnist. If geopolitical events call for it, you stage an eat-in at the Middle Eastern restaurant or order the French wine. And those things probably sound simple, but I know from our own lives, doing those things often lead to much more profound conversations that we have with our friends or with our relatives. Or, I used to wear these bracelets that had the names of women who died from abortions, and I wore them for like a good 10 years of my life. And inevitably, I'd be sitting next to somebody on an airplane or a bus, and they would say, "What are those bracelets? Who are those?" People list on the bracelets, and it would lead to these great conversations, not all happy conversations, but it would lead nonetheless to ones where I was challenged in my beliefs in a way that I was appreciative of, and I think that I in turn was able to challenge other people. And I think the problem with some of this is that we're always looking for kind of like the greater good, and we're always intimidated that there's conflicts in our lives that will underline our political message. And the thing that Jennifer and I have really observed over these last 4 years is that we've yet to meet somebody who is entirely resolved and perfect, who really walks, the talk. Everything in their life is totally, thought out, and they don't wear, they only buy hemp. They only live in houses that are made of bamboo because there's a surplus of bamboo in this country. They don't drive cars. They don't even ride in cars because they're negative. So we've yet to find that perfect person, and the people who come close seem to be people who live on trust funds anyway, so that's its own problem of capitalism and exploitation. But it doesn't mean that if we're in conflict about things that we aren't able to be in process, and that process isn't leading us to a greater place. And so don't let the assumption that you are a walking contradiction, I think, prevent you from doing things, because you're never going to be at that perfect place. I mean, I both buy Nike running shoes and protest Nike. And I think that a lot of us have those experiences in our lives, and it's about finding out how you can be most effective and what is the way that you can be an activist.
And one thing that Amy and I have been talking about a lot lately is the idea of just being someone who doesn't hit delete on your email when someone asks you a question that you're like, why are you asking me? Look it up. Google it. Don't ask me. I'm busy, And we realize that even though sometimes we do react that way to email requests that we get, or to someone calling us and asking us something, or she has the online advice column that she was talking about, Ask Amy, when she opens up her email from that, and there's 90 requests that all seem pretty urgent. How, sometimes you think, well, I don't even know these people. I don't need to respond. When you do take the time to respond, I think it starts this journey that is very activist. First of all, it implies that you actually do think you have something to offer and that you could make some change. And the bottom line is you probably could, which I'm not saying if someone's writing to you and saying, I'm about to commit suicide, that you pretend that you're a psychologist and, hang a shingle, but you could always find a resource to make a decent referral, or to even oftentimes when we get requests from strangers or with questions, or stories, wanting to talk about a rape or something scary that they're going through or bad feelings that they're having, they really just want to feel like someone is listening and someone actually values or acknowledges that something's going on. And so a lot of our activism has become responding to these emails. And a lot of what's in the book grew out of emails of just very random urgent requests that came our way. And some were so vague. There's one right here that I'll just read. I'm a 20-year-old woman who considers myself to be a feminist, yet I don't feel that I'm making any sort of contribution. My friends feel the same way I do. Do you have ideas of things we can do or organizations we can help with to make us feel more a part of the third wave? Help, please! Exclamation point, exclamation point. So, you could just say, this person has no idea even where to start, and so I can't help them. Or you could offer some suggestions, and it's been really interesting, especially for me, realizing that sometimes when I did just want to delete it, sometimes you are too tired and you're allowed to get off the hook, but when I did want to delete it or think, well, that's just ridiculous that person's reaching out to me, it had to do with my own insecurity that I had anything to offer. And Amy and I have been talking a lot lately about when we first met, which I was an intern at Ms. Magazine, and then later, right away after that, I was a low-level employee. And so I answered the phone, and Ms. didn't have voicemail because, as I often say, if it's good technology or comfortable, it's not feminist. So, so I was the voicemail, and took messages on these pink pads. And but there were some good points that I have to say. All the direct interaction that I had with people who call Ms., which is like Alice Walker and Andrew Dworkin and all these kind of interesting, But also I had direct interactions with people who were calling about very urgent crises in their lives. And it was intimidating to get those calls, but I think I felt this sense of, because I was at Ms., I felt this sense of like, oh, well, I'm qualified. In that setting, I'm qualified. And there was this really helpful Rolodex that another earlier intern who had been getting these calls had made of women's organizations. This was just Googling. And it was amazing. I could pretty much look into the women's, into the Rolodex and find something to offer. Each person, always call them back. And it was an incredible feeling to know that I had returned all of those phone calls and to know that I had some sort of response, even if it sort of met with not the greatest response on the other side, just knowing that I didn't drop it, and that things were find outable, that you can actually get to the bottom of these things. And that actually just randomly makes me think of email activism when people forward things, and your comment about how there was still something to learn. Someone was saying something about how they thought this wasn't for seasoned activists, and I thought, if I had a dime for every seasoned activist who sent me that Dr. Hager's going to be head of the FDA email, I would be a rich woman. And so we do all need sometimes to remember how to do the bare minimum, how to do the basics, and get back to like, oh, how can I get to an original source? Am I passing on received wisdom? How can I figure this out for myself and be the most effective activist I can be? So on that note, we want to open it up for questions or comments. If people have things to say. If not, we can just keep talking. Oh, some of it.
On that very last point, it's so interesting that you say that kind of what is the received knowledge and what is your own intuition or your own, discovered or revealed, use that word, knowledge. Can you say more about that? Or you're coming to terms with, not continuing to pass along things that are derivative learning or that, is not analyzed at all, and so you're not taking a part of it, you're not putting yourself into it. I don't know if that makes you think of anything. But
well, one thing is that it's definitely sorry. Thank you. I always remember, and I don't. The question was just to kind of say more about this idea of not accepting received wisdom or derivative knowledge and kind of trusting either your intuition or figuring things out. And I think that that idea was a major impetus for writing Manifesta, and also for Grassroots, but for Manifesta specifically because we wanted to write a pro-feminist critique. We didn't want to tear down feminism because feminism was so important to us and we were so invested in it. But we wanted to point out that because of feminism's success in a way in the 30 years of history, of second wave history that we were just lucky to have been born and raised in, that there were certain just sort of entrenched bits of wisdom, or there were things that were being passed down that weren't being, tested for their accuracy anymore. And just because they were passed down by feminists didn't mean that we shouldn't test them for accuracy. In fact, that is what each generation do is they kind of unearth the received wisdom of that generation, the ways in which it's penalizing all of us, or penalizing women especially, and they find their real truths through consciousness raising or dinner parties or just speaking out or doing research or whatever it is that takes them on that process. And so it's crucial as feminists to always be wary of received wisdom, and it doesn't mean that you're turning your back on feminist history. It just means that you're making sure that these things are still accurate.
And we dedicate, actually, Manifesto to those who say, I'm not a feminist, but we also dedicate it to those who say, I am a feminist, but. And it was interesting because even in the final edits, the editor kept changing that because she didn't understand what we were trying to say. We were trying to, I think, reach out to all those people who say to us, I am a feminist, but I'm pro-life. I'm a feminist, but I eat meat. I'm a feminist, but you know what? I had a huge wedding last year that cost my parents $50,000. I'm a feminist. And then I think historically the response to that was, they were responding to historical feminism where they thought that there was a checklist of what made you a feminist and what did not make you a feminist. And what we say in response to that is, great, then use that as your entry point for activism, which leads directly to Grassroots. If you are a feminist, and then you have this issue that you don't feel like is prioritized. It's often being a stay-at-home mother, or you work in academia, or you are in a non-traditional female job, like being a coal miner. It's like that's where you have to interpret the activism for yourself and for your community. And then we end Manifesto by quoting June Jordan in this interview with her, where she talks about listening to Martin Luther King on the radio. And June Jordan was an incredible poet and really kind of feminist visionary and speaker. And she died a couple years ago of cancer. And she had, really looked up to Martin Luther King and been a part of the civil rights movement. And she talks about listening to him on the radio and not agreeing with him, and how that was a really profound moment for her. And it was that I am a feminist, but I don't agree with, and it's that moment where we learn that it's up to us to own it, that I think is what kind of demarcates kind of then and now for many of us.
I just want to say that this book was great. I found it really helpful going from the transition of, being in college and having all that free time, in order to do, activism, thanks to, being an intern and being out there all the time, to, having absolutely no time and just finding things to do in the time that you do have. And also thanks for in that chapter on Katie Brophy and Manifesto.
Our pleasure.
She's just saying thank you for the book, especially because after you get out of college, it gets a little bit more difficult. And then referring to a chapter in Manifesto called Who's Afraid of Katie Brophy, who's now living in Brooklyn with her husband and baby, I just learned. So I was like, wow, she retreated. I mean, that's a feminist thing, but I was like, we don't hear about her anymore. I was like...
I'm really interested in the ways that different generations of feminists can work together. And I just haven't seen a lot of successful instances of it. Because I do think that different generations of people do have to define things for themselves and learn things and whatever. But it saddens me sometimes when I see the inability of our different generations of feminists to really build things together and even talk the same language. What did you find for this book in terms of different, grassroots instances of women reaching across generations and doing it successfully? Anything?
I mean, that question was essentially, how do we work together across generations, and is there anything in Grassroots where we document that being done successfully?
I could be wrong, but I don't think we document that. But that doesn't mean it's not happening. Actually, Amy and I see successful intergenerational work all the time. I think the tension is more fun to talk about. I don't know, like more obvious sometimes, more uncomfortable. But, I mean, one of the things as just an exercise that I think seems like it could be useful is that if young women are being outreached to by older women, or a traditional sort of organization is saying, and now we want a young women's task force, let's say, to be part of it, to make sure that then also the more traditional established group goes to the young women's task force meetings, doesn't just sort of like, parent it in, big sister it in, but not really treat it very seriously. and and attend their meetings as a respectful listener in the same way that I think, younger women are more likely to, because we look up to or whatever do for other people, to realize that there's a lot to be learned from the younger women's perspective. Amy and I have lots of good intergenerational relationships, and now that we're in our mid-30s, we're having them, with teenagers. And so another generation down, and things are different. I mean, the main thing we notice is they're so much better at computer things than we are. We'll be like, no, there's this thing called the internet, and they're way ahead of us. But I think it will be a challenge to us because we've talked about this so much, challenging older women to understand that it can't just be like, oh, I want you to acknowledge me, or I want you to read my books. That you have to be reading their magazines or listening to their music or whatever they're creating in feminist culture of another generation. That it has to be reciprocal, and hoping that we'll be able to recognize and be reciprocal too.
Two things that I think are in the book that relate to that. One is kind of an amorphous thing, and one is a very tangible thing. The tangible thing is that there were some students at Barnard College who were thinking, like, why are, we're at a great all-women's college, and so our professors must be paid the same, and our female professors must be paid the same, and it led them on this exploration, and learned that not only are there more, male tenured professors, and are they being paid more at every level except the most junior level. And so the students were in actually a better position to take this on than the faculty members who tended to be older, and they took it to the faculty members, and the faculty members were like, great, go ahead and run with it. And we kind of document that a little bit in here, and we actually just had a conversation with somebody at the Harvard Law School who's a professor there, and she was saying that is often the role that she has to play. It is encouraging the students who have more leveraging power at universities to be able to do that, and that is some cross-generational work. And the other thing that is just more amorphous that's in there, it is recognizing that thank you doesn't always come in the form of thank you. And I think that is often the kind of the beginning of a lot of intergenerational tensions. It's thinking young women don't get it, and younger women feeling like, oh, God, older women are just so annoying that they're always lecturing at us. And that communication breakdown, I think, could be solved if we realize that continuing the activism is an expression of thank you. And so the indirect way that it's in this book is that call to take it on in your own life in whatever form that might take. And on this topic, it's so appropriate because one of the person who just walked in, Marlene Freed, who's like sitting out in the hallway, is one of these women who is incredible about breaking down the generational divide. And Marlene does many things, but one of the things she does has spearheaded this conference at Hampshire College for the 20th year now, 19th year. She has brochures here. However many years, she'll hand them out. Oh, okay, great. Oh, Susanna. Okay, great. We have it's in April 1st through 3rd at Hampshire College, and she recognized that they were every year bringing these incredible young women to this. And then simultaneous to this, and I don't know if these two experiences are related, this is my interpretation of it, Marlene goes to these meetings where she's often with all of the other heads of national pro-choice organizations or other women who are leading this movement. Oftentimes, those are much older women. And in those conversations, young women are absent. And at the same time, there's this conference going on. And at Marlene's initiation, there grew this thing called NILNI, the New Leadership Network Initiative. And now all of these young women who are in more junior positions in all of these organizations come together, and they have this networking now that they can use. And I think just having that body makes them more visible and makes their contribution more visible. And I think simultaneously there's been, I think, an understanding that those two meetings shouldn't always happen simultaneous, but just that they're happening separately and they're always keeping each other informed about it. That is cross-generational, and that they're both continuing the work. So that's not exactly documented in here, but since she's here, it's a good example of it. Back.
whether you've gotten a lot of inquiries from your readers about that idea.
Yeah, there was a lot to that question. I'm not going to get all of it, but it's essentially: is there a need to, or are we finding that a need to take on kind of motherhood and feminism? And do we hear that from the people who read our book and otherwise engage with us? And yes, I'm actually writing a book called Opting in: The Case for Motherhood and Feminism. And so, and it is a direct, I mean, I happen to now be a mother, but I came to these ideas, and Jennifer shares them with me because we would often be on radio shows, and the number one caller would be a woman who was like, I'm a stay-at-home mom, or I'm a mom, or I'm raising 4 kids, or I'm a dad, and I'm here with my 2-year-old. What can we do? Both, how can we be more politically involved in this moment in our lives, but also how can we be more visible because people keep overlooking us? And so these conversations led me to kind of conversations that I was having in my friend group, about what it means today. And it obviously is a direct reaction, to articles out there saying that this generation of women wants to opt out and just wants to be at home. And I have yet to find, somebody who really wants to opt out. I mean, because it's not that you're opting out of the workplace, it's that you're opting out of the world, essentially. I mean, because the way they present these stories is that you just want to, never leave your home, and you just want to be at home listening to Baby Einstein all day long. And I think that there is a real problem that we're facing, every generation, when it comes to the demands on us in our work world, and how can we balance those things better, all the things that give us fulfillment, which is, in most people's estimation, having family time and having more traditional work time. But I also think that there are more and more creative solutions out there. And so, Jennifer and I are both in kind of unconventional families. We both have little kids, and we both find a way to make it possible for us to do both. And I think that it's been treated that we're more the minority, and then there's this other norm. But actually, and it might just be because we live in the East Village of New York City, and that we talk at feminist places across the country, but we actually have more conversations with people who are doing what we're doing, which is making it work in a creative way. And so I think we need to both talk about those stories more, and at the same time we need to pressure both our workplaces and also our partners often and our families to allow those different scenarios to kind of emerge. I don't know, we were asked about this a lot yesterday. I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, well, I was just, when you said the thing about security moms, my son's only 4.5 months old, so maybe I just haven't had a chance to worry about this yet, but I wouldn't say I feel more invested in national security, or in protecting people from being killed in Iraq than I did before. I feel the same, and so I sort of reject, I guess, those essentialist ideas, but I certainly think motherhood can be feminist and can be very radical and activist, and often is. And I'm very excited to read Amy's book. So.
You had a question right here.
Yeah, I was so excited to hear you talk about Legally Blonde. I thought I was and I've never admitted that before. But it was actually that ending. I want to talk about it. It was that ending scene where she. Well,
no, you can't.
It was this ending scene where she's marching in Washington with millions of other people, and it was that image of power. And my question for you is, beyond accessing power and beyond finding the power within, what are your thoughts about building power? And I ask it because I found in my journey through activism, especially through feminist activism, there's a real love-hate relationship with power. And often it's hate, kind of wanting to keep it at a distance. But the more I've, come to realize, I think I have come to realize that it's so important, and yet I feel so ill-equipped sometimes to actually get to the strategy of how to build it, to get to the point where you're marching with 1 million people in Washington and not just making a phone call yourself to your senator.
Right. The question is regarding feminist love-hate relationship with power, and how does one really build power? And the questioner loves Legally Blonde too, and also remarked that she feels like there's a lot of intimidation. I think feminists feel intimidation from power, or you've observed more hatred of power than love of it. I think that's really true. And I think one of the things that Amy and I try to do, and then refer to a lot in Grassroots is this idea of having a foot in the very fierce, wonderful, glorious feminist margin that has been created before us and that we're contributing to. Have a foot there and understand that power. But don't be afraid of or don't totally reject or don't misunderstand the power of the mainstream or establishment things or things that have power in more traditional ways like money. And it's interesting because Catherine Welsh, who's a good friend of ours, is here, and she opened a feminist bookstore that we write about in probably Manifesto and Grassroots. No, I guess just Grassroots because it hadn't happened before Manifesto. But she opened a feminist bookstore in New York when there wasn't a feminist bookstore, and you were probably 23 years old, and if you had known how much work it was, I'm sure you wouldn't have done it. But it was this wonderful thing. It was just a couple blocks from where Amy and I lived, and we really used it as a home base for so many things we were working on, and so many activists did. It was really neat. And Catherine was part of this wonderful feminist collective, and da-da-da. Fast forward a few years, she decides to go to Harvard Business School, which is where she is right now. And I think that the idea that she is getting the skills and the connections and the power that Harvard can give to this business experience that she already has, and to this way of looking at the world and the value system that she has is going to be very powerful. And so this idea of having one foot, not rejecting where we come from or the things that we've built that are more on the margins and weaker in some ways, and also not hating the power.
And I think it's also about using power more responsibly, and maybe that's feminism's investment in it. And to use Catherine's example, again, we're just going to get up here and speak for her. She did try to run the bookstore as a collective, and I know felt really frustrated because there is this, I think, feminist vision that we want to be able to have consensus at all times, and we want to make everything a conversation, and we never want anybody's feelings to be heard, and we never want there to be hierarchy. But at the end of the day, a lot of people come just to be heard and not to do the work. And at the end of the day, some of the bills needed to be paid, and the bookstore needed to open and close, and a lot of the responsibilities did default to Catherine. And so while I think we have a feminist vision, there's also a feminist reality. And I think that hierarchies don't have to be oppressive. And I think that one of the things we try to do in Grassroots is try to envision new ways of doing things. A couple years ago, I tried to create a socially responsible investment fund that was pro-woman. And I realized that when I was, asked what pro-woman was, I was like, well, how many women CEOs do you have? And how many women in leadership positions? And how many from women of color? And how many lesbians do you hire? And I was doing it in this total numbers game. And I realized, as we all know, you can have a female Secretary of State and not necessarily have that person embody feminist values. And so I had to really think about what it would be to have a feminist thing or a pro-woman thing. And, I think someplace like Starbucks, which pays even part-time employees health insurance, contrasted with something like Walmart that even full-time employees have to pay up, at a minimum $200 per month of their health insurance, and only after they've worked there for 6 months. So I think that is kind of a feminist value. In Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, he talks about the Gore Company. They make dental floss, so for all loyal flossers, we'd know that, and as well as Gore-Tex. And they never have a workplace site that has more than 90 people because they say that after that point, the culture is dehumanized in a workplace. And also, every employee has the same job title. Regardless, and the same cubbyhole. There's no kind of distinction of the corner office, and then the airless, windowless center things. And so I think that when we're talking about power, we have to, as Jennifer said, both reject it, as it's been traditionally wielded against women and communities of color, but then I think we also have to use it in a way that can be more effective and use it in a way where we can reimagine everybody being a part of it, of power. I mean, that question is kind of building in some ways on the last one about power, but specifically addressing women of color and, non-white middle-class worlds, and how can feminism not repeat the same mistakes of history. And I know there's one anecdote that Jennifer will give, but I think we were having this long conversation today over at Northeastern, and the head of the Women's Studies department there is a woman of color, and she is the first woman of color to be the head of that department, and she thinks the only woman of color to head a Women's Studies department on the Eastern Seaboard. And after she said this, I was almost about to be like, congratulations, and then I was like, that's kind of condescending, because it's actually not congratulations to her, it's like shame on all of you for not doing that. And we had an interesting conversation about race. And I think that by default of growing up after the second wave, or kind of in the second wave, third wave feminists are both learning from, I think, mistakes or shortcomings that they witnessed in the women's movement, mostly that color was added later. It was sort of like, let's create a women's health project, and then, 5 years into it, we'll create a, women of color organizing project as a part of our work. And so I think that a lot of feminists today, not solely third wave, but feminists today, are sensitive to including that diversity from the beginning. I think the other thing that's just, we live in a more diverse time. And I think that brings actually a greater challenge to third wave feminists, because I think historically you could have people of different races in the room and it felt like a diverse space. And I know from my own experiences with the Third Wave Foundation is we have tons of diversity. We're more than 50% not white, we're more than 50% not straight, and yet you look around the room and we're all kind of like, roughly like a size 6 or 8 or 10, and we all went to some college, and we all at least have bought something at Starbucks once. You know what I mean? We all kind of live in a very middle-class framework. And so I think that it is more complicated for us today, because what does it mean? And the other conversations that we have at Third Wave is then when you have the breakout group for women of color, then the person's like, okay, but we have to have the breakout group on refugee rights then, if we're going to have that. And then somebody's like, well, then we have to have the breakout group on transgenderism, and then we have to have the breakout group on disabled transgenders. And you're just, by the end of it, you're like, oh my gosh, are we really making each other invisible so much to the point that we can only be visible with our light community? And so I think that is the challenge to feminism, is how do we make all of us visible in this movement?
And on that note, feminism has always been led in many ways by women of color. Women of color have always been very, very involved in the history of feminism, and when we give our very short history of feminism in Manifesta, we start with Paula Gunn Allen's phrase, the red roots of white feminism, which is that the Haudenosaunee Indians in Upper New York State actually held a women's rights conference several hundred years before the 1848 Seneca Falls Women's Rights Conference. And not just that, not just the kind of vibe that they were providing on that space, but the women that had the Seneca Falls Conference were very influenced. Matilda Joslyn Gage in particular were very influenced by those women, and the fact that they lived and had created with men a much more egalitarian society, a society in which they could vote. Possibly even the idea to vote was in many ways, it was partially, realizing that they were fighting for the right to vote for black men in part of the abolitionist movement, but also it was identifying that there were women who were voting right there, nearby, neighbors of theirs, voting in Native elections, and so tribal elections. And so there is this long history of women of color being part of feminism, and especially if we were thinking about feminism as this kind of inherent dignity. It isn't something white women have been able to everyone kind of feels that on a deep level. You don't just have it for yourself. The ways that we've interpreted or valued what feminist gains have often been mainly using, as Amy was saying, these white middle class sort of standards. And the places that are the most visibly feminist and that use the word feminist tend to be more white and middle class. But it's cool that Marlene is here, because I went to see her speak recently in support of a book that she co-authored called Undivided Rights, and it's about reproductive justice and women of color organizations. And one woman who's another co-author is Loretta Ross, and she's someone who was interviewed for the I Had an Abortion documentary that I referred to earlier, and she's just this incredible activist in many, many fields. But she said this great thing, which was that it was very hard for her and all of them to not make the book about what white women weren't doing for them, and to make it about what women of color did for themselves and are still doing for themselves. And it's an incredible book, actually. And I really felt inspired or touched by that thought, because I think it is an invitation for white women who feel nervous to even broach these topics because of insecurities about our privilege, or just not even knowing how to do it, to feel, especially as Marlena's white. You haven't seen her because she's sitting there on the stairs. But she was the white co-author on a book by, for, and about women of color. And just being able to have those conversations and be able to deal with the discomfort, I felt like Loretta's remarks and Marlene's were such an invitation, and also providing a model of doing it.
And I just want to, what you said at the end, and I think I just want to underscore that point of sometimes it is saying no yourself as a white woman. And I know that Jennifer and I have had to do that when somebody calls us and says, oh, we want to invite you to a panel on the future of feminism. And it's you two, and then we're also going to have Gloria Steinem, and then we're also going to have Betty Friedan. And you kind of look at that and you're like, okay, if that's the future of feminism, then we shouldn't be a part of it, because it really does need to speak to what the future of feminism is going to look like and is going to act like. So I think that there are ways that we can do that on a daily basis. Pick up on that. The question was just that we actually do need to put feminism in white middle-class worlds more. And I'm up here, I'm like, oh my gosh, should we not make our point clear? Because everybody always thinks that we're actually in bed with Starbucks because we promote them so much. But we actually do think that that's a place where we need to move. And I know from myself that, and I've witnessed this happen time and time again, that it does have more power, me as a white middle-class straight woman, if I say that's not funny to a homophobic joke, or that's not funny to a racist joke. It just brings more power with it. And, some of the examples we document in Grassroots are, for instance, the man Louis Platt, who was the head of Hewlett-Packard and was left after his wife unfortunately died to raise his young kids. And he kind of went, oh my gosh, this is really tough work and raise kids, and I never knew what my employees went through. And then changed the whole culture of HP. And so we not only need to put feminism in those places, but we need people that are already in those places to recognize the value of feminism and how it can benefit their workplace, or it can benefit those white middle class institutions.
And as far as if we have pop cultural representations of feminism, it's true that when we were growing up in the 70s, feminists, I guess, had some influence. There was the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and there was One Day at a Time, and Single Mother, blah, blah. Alice. But there is a lot of third-wave feminism in mainstream pop culture. And I mean, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I know is not happening anymore. But those 7 years that was some of the most coherent feminist writing I've ever read or seen. I guess I didn't read it. I watched it. And what was so wonderful about it, too, was that not only was it very complex, and I think got at a lot of the psychological complexities of feminism, it also had a happy ending, because Buffy didn't have to be the martyr at the end of it. And that was something that I actually hadn't seen in the second wave things that I was lapping up. She got to spread the power and didn't have to be that one that, if she didn't do it, it wasn't going to get done person. I'm obsessed with Buffy, so
I think that, I just was thinking about this, I think there's a danger, though, because I think some feminists think that middle-class values are what got us into this problem in the first place. And so it's we all need to reject that. And so I think that I definitely welcome what you're saying, but I think there's some people who work, and it's not just feminine, I mean, it's more like the socialist groups and the communist groups, that are not willing to engage with those institutions. And so I think that for those of you who maybe don't want to, sleep with the enemy, it's like there is always a simultaneous need to do both things at once.
Can I actually add something?
Yeah.
The
Can
other
you add into the microphone so we don't have to repeat? Thanks.
Sorry, I'm sort of weird about this. This is not my event. But the other thing I would add is that if you're talking about representations on TV and in the media, I think that one thing that we can be doing is working to change who gets to create the images and messages we hear on the TV and the media. That it's true that white middle-class America isn't reflecting our values to us on the TV and the media, but that's because, who's controlling that. And there's a lot that we can be doing more to change who has access and who has control of the messages that are getting reflected back out to us.
And you can come to their media conference.
Exactly.
Are there any other questions?
I sort of assume from the way you're hearing and talking and reading through your books that you think that writing is an important kind of activism of its own. I'm assuming that, I could be wrong. So I'm wondering if you have I wonder if you have ever felt tension around your desire to be activists and your desire to spend time writing, which I think of as a pretty solitary, important activity, but solitary. And if so, sort of how do you manage that, or how do you balance wanting to be active and writing, which is also activism, but doesn't always feel like activism?
The question is, how do we balance writing with activism, since writing is such a solitary pursuit and activism is so typically out there in the world? Well, when we write together, we wrote these two books literally nose to nose. We really do sit in the same room together doing it. And so that felt not solitary, which was really nice. And we got to work these certain things out, and it did feel like consciousness-raising sessions frequently. Also grammar-raising sessions where we were like, did either of us go to grammar school? Because there were so many issues around copy editing. But and kind of getting to brainstorm together in these great ways and then test things out. But I think that a lot of the writing that Amy and I do requires being very out there in the world in a way that really works with activism. I don't feel I understand that schism, and I see it with a lot of my writer friends. I don't feel it so much in my life, and because we do a ton of reporting, and all of the stuff that we're drawing from, the fact that we have legitimacy in so far as we do, comes from these connections that we have to a grassroots community or to experts or whatever. And so we are constantly, the fact that we are activists feeds what we're writing about all the time.
Yeah, I think I went into Manifesta thinking I was much more of an activist, and my desire to write was that I wanted to document these things that I was experiencing. And I think Jennifer went into Manifesta being much more of a writer. And it's been interesting because now we're really more meshed and in this book. And I think we don't see them as separate. I think we see both writing itself as a process of activism, what we write, then other people use, ideally, but also the way we get these stories is by out there being activists. And so we couldn't do one without the other. At least we couldn't write the things that we wanted to write without kind of living in that world. And I think it's also what you define as writing. I think that these books are kind of more typical of writing, but the online advice column I have, that process is writing. It's disseminating resources to people on a more immediate basis. And so I very much think that is necessary to activism. We're also going to sign books, so if people have questions that they don't want to ask here, they can ask there. And we're going to have, we'll leave these flyers from abortion rights to social justice up here, and there's lots of other things on this table. Thank you.
And thanks for having us.
Coming.